Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of Togainu no Chi. Last time we went ahead and finally arrived at Toshima and we saw fornication of the same sex persuasion and the necrophilic persuasion as well simultaneously. And we're not sure which one Akira was more disturbed by, but hey, getting disturbed by same-sex relationships and relations and contact has been a trademark of Japanese BL. So let's just go ahead and continue. Now, everyone Akira met would know him as an Igra fighter. The die, as they said, had been cast. He brushed his fingertips against the tag hanging from his neck. It felt cold to the touch. Stupid cat. Just then, above the seething din that defined Toshima's night, he heard something that didn't belong. It sounded like someone walking through rubble and kicking things aside. Akira rose silently, his eyes fixed on the entrance, and reached for the knife at his waist. Someone was here. He focused his senses. Through the doorless entrance, he could see the cityscape on the far side of the road melting away into darkness. The light of the moon formed a pale veil. Suddenly, a human-shaped shadow blocked out the scenery. His whole body went tense. If the person moved on, good. But if he came inside... He slowly closed his hand around the hilt of his knife. The shadow moved and Akira heard the crunch of tile. Another step, the same sound. Shadow had set foot inside the shop. No choice. He drew his knife and prepared to strike.
Akira.
Akira doubted his own ears. Though it was barely a whisper, he knew that voice well. You know that Simp would follow you here. It couldn't be. For a moment he thought he was hearing things, but no. The speaker was right in front of him, and he had undeniably called his name. He groped for the flashlight and switched it on. His ears hadn't failed him. The circle of light revealed Keisuke, shielding his eyes from the blinding lights. Why? Why was he here? Akira stared at Keisuke in utter disbelief.
Akira だろ
Keisuke's voice jolted him back to himself. He turned off the flashlight, lobbed it aside, and dashed up to Keisuke, grabbed his arm, and dragged him deeper into the store. Keisuke had lost his balance and staggered, colliding with a nearby table. Akira hissed a warning, but didn't let go until they'd reached the back of the shop.
やっぱりアキラだよかった間違ってたらどうしようかと
We have an idea what might have happened to him if he had been wrong. Need I remind you of the necrophiliac? He leaned closer to Keisuke, who had a relieved smile on his face.
なんでこんなところにいるんだお前なんでってどうやってここまで来た急措地区を抜けてきたのか
No matter where in the CFC you came from, it was impossible to reach Toshima without going through the old lands. Akira doubted that he could have even survived that hell without guidance. Had Keisuke made it through alone? Keisuke cast his gaze downward, muttering guiltily under his breath.
仕方ないってアキラは言ってたけどやっぱどうしても心配でさどうにかしたくてこの間俺に話をしてくれた日の次の朝が出発だって言ってただろだから後をつけたのか
Glancing meekly at Akira, Keisuke gave a small nod. Akira let out an enormous sigh, exasperated to the point of speechlessness. This was insane. Was Keisuke trying to get himself killed? He looked the smaller man up and down. He was wearing his usual shabby blue coveralls and had a light backpack over his shoulder.
武器は何も
For a moment, all Akira could do was gape.
よくそれで何もなかったな。
そりゃ危ない目にはあったよ。難民だっけあいつら。すごい勢いで飛びかかってきて、このままじゃアキラも見失うしまずいと思って、それで全速力で走って逃げた。
逃げた？
じゃなかったら俺はここにいないよ。
Was Keisuke really that fast? Then again, the guide had said the refugees didn't pursue their prey over long distances. If Keisuke had made it through that labyrinth at the outskirts of Toshima, they might have left him alone. Maybe he was just that lucky. But that wasn't the point. Akira folded his arms and gave Keisuke a hard stare.
それでどうするんだよ。
何が？
Perhaps sensing Akira's displeasure, Keisuke responded
こ
timidly.
んなところまでついてきてどうするつもりだ。
だから何か力になれることがあったらと思って。
There was nothing Keisuke could help him with. On the contrary, his presence was a burden. It would make moving around the city more difficult. Keisuke was utterly clueless. Akira could feel his irritation growing.
帰れよ。
どうして？
昨日も言ったはずだ。これは遊びじゃない。
Keisuke's face contorted as if he were struggling with something.
俺は終身刑で惨めに死を待つよりはマシだからここまで来た。すぐに終わらせて戻る。誰の助けもいらない。
Akira made his tone hard and sharp, knowing that it would hurt Keisuke. It was the only way his words would reach. It had always been like this, ever since they were children. Keisuke never thought things through. He would work frantically to do what he felt was right, and it would backfire every time. Every time? Come on, now you're just being a little hyperbolic. And despite his inability to follow through, he was also curiously stubborn. If Akira didn't make himself perfectly clear, he would never realize how serious this was. Akira had no intention of losing, of course, but there's no guarantee that he would make it out alive. It'd be one thing if Keisuke were handy in a fight, but that simply wasn't the case. He can learn. Keisuke's hands formed loose fists, his eyes still fixed on his feet.
帰るならまた急措地区を抜けなくちゃいけない。ここまではアキラを追ってきたからたどり着けたようなもので。
True. This time Keisuke would have to cross the old lands alone and without losing his way.
道は覚えてないか。
A disappointed sigh spilled from Akira's mouth. He considered sending Keisuke back anyway, telling him he'd brought this upon himself. But that'd be going a tad too far. Besides, Keisuke had technically done it for his sake. Plus, he'd have trouble sleeping at night if he later came face to face with Keisuke's corpse. What to do? I guess ellipses, bruh. I guess this is our first ever choice ever. God, I really hate this menu in this game. There. It takes me forever to find the quick save. Wait, I just want the regular save menu. God damn it. What? Okay, it doesn't let me. Oh, I see. It always quick saves whenever there's a choice. I see. Okay. Whatever. Ellipses.
アキラ？
Keisuke looked up as though to assess Akira's response. Now they had fallen silent. There was no other choice. If Keisuke couldn't go home, he would have to remain here. With obvious reluctance, Akira opened his mouth.
帰れないならいるしかないだろう。
Even though this was the answer Keisuke wanted, he himself seemed surprised by Akira's
い
reply.
いのか？本当に？
It wasn't about whether he was okay with it. After watching Akira's cheerless face for a little while, Keisuke put on a small smile.
よかった。ありがとう、アキラ。
He hadn't done anything deserving of gratitude, but Keisuke appeared genuinely happy. It felt peculiar.
何かあったら手伝うから。
With no way to answer him, Akira wordlessly sat down on the sofa. For better or for worse, they were stuck together now.
明日からはどうする？
Seating himself beside Akira, As he spoke, Keisuke trailed off in the middle of his sentence, then made a weird noise. Maybe he was biting back a yawn. He leaned back in the sofa and rubbed his eyes, then gave Akira a sluggish look. It appeared to be taking all his effort just to stay awake.
ごめん。なんか落ち着いたら急に眠くなってきた。少し寝てもいいかな。
Did Keisei actually mean to go straight to sleep? Here? Maybe he truly didn't understand the situation. Weren't you going to sleep here? But what could Akira do about it? He shook his head. It felt like looking after a child.
アキラは
俺はいい。
Akira was weary, but his thoughts remained clear. He wasn't likely to fall asleep anytime soon.
そうか。体休めておいた方がいいよ。
Keisei clasped his hands over his stomach, his eyelids almost fully closed.
そうだ。それとアキラ。
His closed eyelids rose once more, and he turned to look at Akira. Though he looked hopelessly tired, his mouth still formed a small smile.
絶対勝って一緒に帰ろうな。
I like how he thinks he's part of this. Oh, he's part of the death match. You're just sort of you're just a cheerleader on the sidelines now, babe. This time his eyelids closed more firmly, and his breathing soon slowed into the rhythm of sleep. Akira regarded his sleeping face with ambivalence. The scene he had witnessed through the store window was the kind of world this was. That was hard for me to say because I'm an idiot. What concerned him most of all was Keisuke's failure to grasp this. Sensing many difficulties in store for them, Akira stayed awake, watching the entrance until the sun had risen once more. Only when it had grown light outside did Akira become tired enough to shut his eyes. A half hour later or so, he woke and his mind was clear. In the pale sunlight shining through the entrance, both the cafe and what he could see of the cityscape gave a different impression than they had at night. Not that it seemed any less foreboding. He shifted away from the sofa's backrest. Dust rose to fill his vision with white. When he turned his face to avoid breathing it in, he saw that Keisuke was still sound asleep. His expression was so tranquil as if he were part of another world. Would Keisuke ever have another chance to wallow in such a peaceful slumber? While wondering this, he shook Keisuke gently.
Oi.
Keisuke grunted and stirred a little, then went right back to sleep. Growing impatient, Akira shook him harder.
起きろ。
His eyelids twitched a few times before finally cracking open. Rubbing his eyes, he gave Akira a drowsy smile.
アキラ。
He was utterly at peace. He was so at peace, in fact, that Akira found it downright obnoxious. He slapped Keisuke on the back.
いきなり何すんだよ。
目覚めたか。行くぞ。
Ignoring Keisuke's teary-eyed glare, Akira rose with a bag in his hand.
行くってどこへ？
Keisuke quickly got up and grabbed his bag off the floor.
いくらに決まってる。
Keisuke's expression instantly clouded over.
いくら？
参加証のタグももう用意されてる。
Akira brushed the tag hanging from his neck.
負けたら死ぬかもしれないんだよな。
He was still going on about that? Aggravated, Akira thrust his face close to Keisuke's, looking him right in the eye.
何度も言ってるだろう。これは遊びじゃない。俺も人を殺すことになる。
Keisuke went rigid. In Igra, everything would be on the line. In order to survive, Akira would have to kill. What would that feel like? Crushing the life out of someone as they struggled in his grip, euphoric? Deep in his belly, Akira felt a shiver of anticipation. Yeah, exactly.
それがここのルールだ。殺さなければ殺される。それ以外に道はない。
He was here to bring down Il-Rei, Igra's undefeated champion. The desire to face this invincible tyrant had taken root in Akira's soul. He would have to wade through the blood of many in order to reach that point. The color drained from Keisuke's face. He was finally beginning to understand.
人を殺すんだよな。
じゃなきゃ勝ち残れない。
With that, Akira turned towards the exit.
どこ行くんだよ。
イグラが実際にはどんな形で行われているのか、豊島の住人や他の参加者たちはどうしているのか、少し見てくる。お前はここで待ってろ。
It would be foolish to make a move without first acquiring some basic information.
俺も行く。
Keisuke's desperate offer made Akira pause.
ダメだ、丸腰だろ。
でも一人で待ってるなんて嫌だ。
Deciding it's futile to waste time bickering, Akira sighed and returned to Keisuke. He pulled the knife from his waist and held it out, sheath and
持
all.
ってろ。
アキラは予備のナイフか何か持ってるのか？
いや、
He had left the knife they'd given him back in his room. Keisuke pulled back his
それ
hand.
じゃあ今度はアキラが丸腰になるじゃないか。意味がないよ。
俺はいい。
The use of weapons was forbidden in blasters, so Akira was used to fighting with his fists. As long as he didn't have to deal with guns, which were outlawed in Igura anyway, he'd be fine. Well, you know, I'm sure we can trust a bunch of criminals to follow the law. Like, right? It's illegal. They wouldn't ever have guns. It's outlawed. Right?
一つ約束しろ。
Doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but, you know.
自分の身は自分で守れ。
Keisuke's eyes widened a bit, but he was quick to press his lips together and give a firm nod.
分かった。
He reached for the knife again. Once he'd taken it, he unsheathed it and gazed intently at the blade.
なんか変わったナイフだな。これ文字が書いてある。
昔軍で支給されてたやつだ。
こんなんだったっけ？
多分。
Honestly, Akira wasn't sure. He had never been on an actual battlefield or seen what real soldiers carried.
そっか。そうだったかな。
Nodding, Keisuke returned the knife to its sheath.
行くぞ。
Passing through the doorless exit, they ventured once again onto the streets of Toshima. The sky was an ambiguous pale gray, neither sunny nor cloudy. Well, it looks pretty cloudy to me, but go off. The environment had suffered greatly in the war, and fair weather had been a rare occurrence ever since. Just like last night, Akira didn't see anyone when he looked around the main avenue. Even so, the view was better than at night, and he had no trouble distinguishing the landscape. The atmosphere was also the same as before. Although the street seemed empty, he could sense the presence of all people around. Bloodlust barely concealed, as if they were stalking him from the shadows. Honey, you're just having another drug trip. Calm down. The sun might have risen, but he was in no mood to saunter around in the open.
夜も思ったけど全然人見ないんだよな、この街。
Keisuke murmured, staring or starting towards the center of the road.
おい、
Akira quickly grabbed him by the arm and dragged him back to the shadow of the coffee shop.
無防備に出歩くな。
Unnerved by Akira's harsh tone, Keisuke blinked and nodded. A choking tension filled the air as they started walking. Akira strove to keep the shadows by the roadside. The alleyways they passed from time to time were so dim he could make out nothing of what lurked in their depths. When they came to an intersection, he saw a sign protruding from an alley on the right side off to the east. Utterly faded, yet retaining vestiges of gaudy coloring, it was the kind of sign one might expect to see in a red light district. Just as he looked away, he thought he heard a shrill voice. He glanced back at the alleyway.
何か聞こえなかったか？今声みたいな感じの。
Keisuke was studying the sight intently, having also noticed the sound. Akira barely had heard it, so he couldn't be sure, but the sound had felt out of place in this knife-sharp atmosphere. It nagged at him. He approached the sign. Sign. As Keisuke ran after him, he pressed his back to the wall and took a brief look down the alley. The alley was wider than he thought, with shops lined up in tight rows on both sides. As expected, they were mostly bars and brothels. All were in disrepair, of course. With so many of their decorative lights broken, he doubted it would be very bright, even if they were all switched on. There was no one around, while the same could be said for the rest of Toshima. Imagining how lively it must have been before the war made this place feel even more deserted than the rest. Maybe he'd only imagined the voice after all. Pushing himself away from the wall, he took a step down the alleyway. The road was shadowy, with buildings blocking the sun on both sides. The aura of this place was such that Akira would not have been surprised to find a spirit or two standing amid the skeletal remains of these once crowded stores.
こういうさ、あ、確かに人がいたんだなって簡単に想像できるところってかえって不気味だよな。なんか生々しいっていうか。
He knew what Casey was trying to say. Fear was something that grew stronger the more real its source seemed. But to Akira, very little felt real, or at least real enough to frighten him. He could process a phenomenon and understand it intellectually, but that was different. As he reached the middle of the road, Akira stopped dead in his tracks. He's so edgy, Akira.
Akira?
Somebody was here. Their presence was well hidden, but he could feel it. Where was it coming from? A faint sound. Behind them. Before he could turn. Uh-oh, we hear a twink. Twink alert! A high voice echoed down the alley. The sound of nimble footsteps followed shortly after.
なんだ?
Turn? Their sheer momentum forced him to turn. Ah! He's girly. He's a girly twink. A petite girl... well, it's not a girl, and we all know it. The petite girl appeared in front of them. She had golden hair, a delicate stature, and slim arms and legs. Her large blue eyes were especially striking.
女の子?
The girl's lips curved widely in response to Casey's baffled murmur.
残念でした。ついてます。
ついて?
The crudeness of the answer left Keisuke speechless. Indeed, upon further scrutiny, the stranger's bony fingers and knees were indicative of a male physique. Nevertheless, it was hard not to mistake him for a girl. The smoothness of his skin all but invited one to touch. Is this Akira's inner thoughts?
ってそんなことはどうでもいいわけよ。兄さんたちさ、ここ俺の縄張りなんだけど、勝手に入ってこられちゃ困るんだよね。
縄張り?
そうそう、人の島に無断で踏み込んだやつは
通行料って。
Casey turned back to Akira, his expression bewildered.
というかさ、知らないの？もしかして来たばっかとか。
The boy had been standing with his hands on his hips, brow furrowed, suddenly blinked in surprise.
あ、
Dude.
でもそっちのいい男な兄さんはイグラに参加してんだね。
I don't like this twink. Just looking at him, it's not doing anything for me. The boy put on a challenging smile as he pointed to the tag on Akira's chest. The tag swung across the boy's own chest as well. Another fighter, in other words, an enemy? Perhaps sensing Akira's sudden weariness, the boy flapped a hand at him.
そんな顔しなくても、今んとこは別に戦う気ないから安心してよ。兄さんいい男だしさ。他にボコっちゃってもいい、どうでもいいのがいくらでもいるし。
Keisuke gave the boy a dumbfounded look. Though his appearance was such that people might easily mistake his gender, he seemed utterly at ease in this savage town, even when facing two total strangers. Perhaps he was stronger than he looked. Either way, there was something very odd about him. Meanwhile, oblivious to Akira's growing doubts, the boy had put on a wide grin.
ま、初心者ならしょうがないか。じゃあ通行料は免除にしてあげるよ。兄さんの顔に免じて。
The boy had spent most of the conversation staring at Akira's face. He appeared to have taken quite a liking to it.
ついでに何か聞きたいこととかある？教えられることなら教えてあげる。
That sounded like showing compassion to an enemy. Not starting a fight here was one thing, but offering to lend them a hand? It sparked unavoidable suspicion. Even Keisuke, who was not the suspicious type, gave Akira an uneasy glance. Yet, while Akira sensed that there must be some kind of scheme involved, taking the bait was still an option, if it meant he might acquire some information. At any rate, this was his only lead. That thought made him open his mouth, ending the tense silence that had fallen.
どこか武器が手に入るところを知らないか。
武器？
It bothered him that Keisuke didn't have a weapon. He couldn't keep Akira's knife forever.
武器ね。
The boy seemed to consider this. Akira wasn't really expecting an answer. He knew that such shops had to exist as long as people lived here. There'd be those who sold them what they needed. But even though everyone likely knew where they were, there would be an ironclad rule not to mention them. Why would there be an ironclad rule not to mention them? You're literally in Toshima right now. What? That doesn't make any sense, but go off. Furthermore, Akira was an Igra fighter. In other words, a potential enemy. It would be foolish for the boy to give him any information that might literally be used to stab him in the back.
なんで？まさか素手ってわけじゃないよね。まあスタイルにもよるだろうけど。
俺じゃない。こっちだ。
He pointed his chin at Keisuke, who had the decency to look embarrassed.
ああ、参加してない方の兄さんか。何も持ってないの？
ああ。
そっか。じゃあさ、こんなのはどう？
The boy fished through his waist pouch, then grabbed something and held it out. It was a folding knife, the kind that snapped open with the push of a button. With the blade extended, it was about 20 centimeters long.
これだったら初心者でも扱いやすいし、軽いし。あげるよ。
Keisuke waved both of his hands in front of his face, startled by the boy's casual offer.
いやいや、もらうのは悪いから。
だってさ、めったに使わないし。いいよ。
Keisuke continued his puppy-eyed protest a little while longer, but finally extended his
あり
hands.
がとう。
どういたしまして。
The boy grinned proudly. Even if it was a spare, it was very generous of him to give the knife to a total stranger. Akira could not begin to comprehend the boy's intentions.
じゃあこれ返さなきゃ。はい。
Keisuke pulled Akira's knife from his backpack and handed it over. It was in his backpack? How would you even get that out quickly in a fight? Akira took it and thrust it back through his belt.
貸しにしといてあげる。いつか返して。
The boy's lips spread into an enticing smile.
体で。
Yeah. Keisuke yelped.
なんだよそれ。だって君男だろ。
Ah, yes, of course. The "you're a man, aren't you? Homosexuality doesn't exist" line in BLs. I'm used to those.
やだな。何マジになってんの？冗談だよ。
The boy cackled at the sour expression on Keisuke's face. And then out of the blue, he pulled out Akira's arm. Ah. Oh god. I don't like any of this. He's just not very cute, is he? He really isn't. I thought that even when I watched the anime, I was like, ew, he's kind of gross. Anyway. The boy tugged at Akira's and Keisuke's arms, pulling them close, then looked up at them with an incorrigible smile. Akira had no idea how to handle this display of unearned affection. He sighed, confusion giving way to irritation.
ま、それはさておき、せっかくだから参加すれば、兄さんも。
何に？
イグラにさ。
ああ、うん。いくら。
Keisuke's eyes went wide as saucers.
それこそ冗談だろう。無理に決まってる。
そんなの参加してみなきゃわかんないっしょ。ねえ。
The boy looked to Akira for agreement, but frankly Akira didn't want Keisuke to get involved. It would just make things harder. Perhaps sensing this from Akira's expression, Keisuke redoubled his protests.
ほらな、無理だって。俺だって参加なんかしたくない。
だってさ。
The boy waggled his boot-clad toes suggestively.
この町じゃさ、いつ死んだっておかしくないんだよ。イグラに参加してようとしてなかろうとさ。だったら楽しんだ方がいいじゃん。
What does it mean to waggle your boot-clad toes suggestively? What does that look like? I can't picture it. It's unpicturable. His words carried enough weight to make Keisuke fall silent. For a moment, it seemed that the boy's big eyes were no longer smiling, but that expression vanished as quickly as it came, morphing into a grin so quickly that Akira doubted what he'd seen.
とりあえず説明だけでも受けてみたら、アルビトロンとこ行ってさ。ってそっちの兄さんから詳しいことは聞いてるかな。
Arbitro. That man, Gwen had mentioned this name during the explanation. Arbitro was the man who ran Igra. In order to challenge Il Rey, Akira would have to bring the tags he'd gathered to Arbitro. but he didn't know where to find the man, or, for that matter, where the fight with Il Rey would take place.
行くだけ行ってみろよ。
Keisuke froze with a look of disbelief in his eye.
アキラまで。
そうそう男なら度胸行くだけ言っとけ。
Keisuke shot Akira a brief, resentful glare, then let his shoulders drop. He looked so crestfallen that Akira felt sorry for him.
じゃあ決定かな。いい行っちゃうよ。
The boy who had started off on down the street suddenly turned around.
そういやさ、俺リンって言うんだけど、兄さんたちは？
Was it safe to reveal their names? Akira considered this for a moment. Ultimately, he had a feeling that it was pointless to worry about the boy, Rin's motives. He would never be able to tell whether Rin's friendliness was an act, and forcing himself to remain alert in such a disarming presence would only wear him out.
アキラだ。こっちはケイスケ。
アキラとケイスケね。
Rin resumed walking with a spring in his step. As they followed behind, a pale Keisuke drew close to Akira, whispering.
おいアキラ、どういうつもりだよ。俺は参加するなんて一言も言ってないぞ。
成り行きだろ。登録必須ってわけでもないだろうし、説明だけ聞いて帰ってくればいい。
How do you know they won't force him?
もし登録必須だったらどう
Yeah,
するんだよ。
exactly. You don't really know that, Akira. You don't really know if there's any backing out once you've gone.
トイレにでも駆け込んで、そのまま逃げてこいよ。
お前、一言だと思って。
何よ、何話してんの？
Rin stopped and looked back with a puzzled expression.
いや、なんでもない。
Casey shook his head and forced a friendly smile.
ああ、そうそう。さっきの通行料の話、嘘だから。
嘘？
そう。
Rin nodded like it was nothing. What had he hoped to gain from such a lie, or had it been nothing more than a whim? There was no way to truly tell. Akira shook his head and followed after Rin, pointedly ignoring the reproachful looks that Casey kept sending his way. Huh. Well, guys, I think this is where I shall end this episode of Togainu no Chi today. So, thank you all for watching, and next time we'll go ahead and enter Keisuke in Igra, which is an interesting choice. I'm sure he's not going to do any fighting. I don't really remember the anime, but I don't think he ever fought. Anyway, yeah, so I'll see you guys next time. Bye.